Attic Philosophy just hit 15,000 subscribers, so today we're doing the 15k Q&A. I asked viewers of the channel to ask me anything, and they did, so I'm going to be answering those questions. 15,000 subscribers, maybe that's not huge in YouTube terms, but given that this channel does pretty advanced technical stuff on logic and philosophy, I think that's pretty important, and it made me think about what is this channel really about? You know, over the 4 years I've been doing it, I've tried loads of different things. I've watched loads of stuff about how to grow your channel. A lot of that stuff is like kind of pandering to the YouTube algorithm, doing a lot of clickbait, doing stuff that the algorithm wants you to do. And one thing I've learned here is that for me, for this channel, that really doesn't work. What I really want to do with this, and what seems to be working for you guys, is basically high-level university-style teaching, getting the really good, clear, high-level content out to you guys on YouTube for free. That's what seems to be working the best, and that's what I'm going to be doing going on into the future. So really the core mission is university-style teaching, but getting it out there for free. I've had lots of requests for different topics for future videos. If you've got a request, if there's a video you'd really like to see on this channel, head over to my page at AbleBees. There you can start a petition to get a video made. And if your goal is to learn high-level philosophy or logic through this channel and you need a bit of extra help, if you want to get involved with one-to-one tuition with me, go and have a look at my website and we'll see what we can sort out. Okay, let's get on to your questions. First question. My question is, why did I choose philosophy as my subject? Yeah, great question. Let me tell you the story of how this came about. So I was doing my A-levels at school, so they're the 16 to 18-year-old bit of study at school in the UK. I was studying sciences, so maths, further maths, physics, chemistry, I think. Then I switched to theatre studies later on. And I'd always had this thing of like, I really like doing the sciences, the technical stuff, but I really missed out on studying the arts, English and theatre and all that sort of stuff. So I really wasn't sure what I was going to study at university. You know, school was very much, you got to do one or the other, and universities were like, you know, do you want to do maths? Do you want to do English? And then a new teacher showed up and she was really cool. She liked good music, and I talked to her. And she said, well, have you heard about this thing called philosophy? Really, I hadn't. I had never come across the idea that, you know, philosophy was a thing. I guess I'd heard of Plato, but I thought that was all just stuff from the past. So the idea you could study this at university was kind of completely new to me. So I went to the school library, I read a bunch of books, and I thought, yeah, this is great. It kind of matches up my interests, right? There's a bit of technical stuff, but it's also got this kind of arty, literary kind of thing going on, and that's what I want to do. So I applied for philosophy. Didn't get in the first time I applied. I had a year out. I got better A-level grades, applied again, and got a place to study at Nottingham. That's where I teach now. So that's the kind of, you know, historical explanation. What about my reasons for choosing philosophy? So it's like I said, doing just one kind of thing to me felt very limiting, you know, just pursuing maths and physics or just pursuing, you know, literature and language. It's, you know, both of those things are great, but why does it have to be one or the other? And actually, one of the things I really liked about my university undergrad, it was a modular system. I could take modules in English, in history, in physics, in maths, but it was really philosophy that pulled all of those together. You know, studying quantum physics, I can relate that to our theories of matter and reality. Studying literature, I can relate that to our theories of creativity. All of this kind of comes together when we think about things philosophically. So I think even though this is me kind of recreating my reasons with hindsight, that is really, for me, the big draw of philosophy. It helps us understand the world, it helps us understand ourselves, and it's the link that pulls all of these different subjects together. So I got to university with really no philosophical background. I'd read a few kind of intro books, but I just fell in love with it. It straight away felt like my thing, you know, and I'm still doing it, so I guess I got really lucky. Next question. What was the hardest philosophy for me to learn? Oh, that's a really good question. It's a really tough question because are some philosophies harder than others to learn? Some writers are definitely harder to read than others, but that's different from the philosophy being difficult. So as an undergrad, I really grappled with Wittgenstein for a long time. And really there's two philosophies in there. There's the Tractatus philosophy, the early Wittgenstein, and then there's the later Wittgenstein, which is very much focused on language, the way we use language, and using language to untangle a lot of the traditional problems of philosophy. You know, I found it really difficult to get to grips with some of that stuff. There's loads of different interpretations of Wittgenstein. There's the Anscombe book, there's the John Cook stuff, there's the McDowell stuff, there's the Kripke interpretation on meaning. Trying to pull all that together and kind of weave a coherent thread through that, I found really difficult. I also found it difficult because there's a lot in the later Wittgenstein about philosophy as therapy. So the idea that you don't form new theories of the world, I actually found that quite, I found a lot of resistance to that because I wanted to form theories. I wanted to understand the world and our place in it. And Wittgenstein's kind of saying, don't do that. So I found a lot of pull from Wittgenstein, the charisma and the talk of solving or dissolving all the philosophical problems. Also a bit of pushback from myself because I really did want to understand what's going on in the world. So that was really as an undergrad, spending a lot of time trying to get to grips with Wittgenstein. More recently, I think one of the hardest papers I've struggled with recently is Kit Fine's logic paper, Models for Entailment. So this is a very important paper in the realm of relevant logic and non-classical notions of logical entailment. So I have very vivid memories of trying to get to grips with this paper. It's a paper that lots of the literature mentions, but it's very kind of dismissive. It says, oh yeah, Kit Fine has this approach, but we're not really going to talk about that. So there's basically no secondary literature explaining this paper. It's super technical and it's also full of mistakes and typos. So getting to grips with it, you're always kind of confronted with, have I really understood this? Does this really mean what it says? Or should that bit be the other way round? I've got these very vivid memories because I was studying it on a study visit to New York University. So I was living in Brooklyn. Every night I kind of took myself off on my own to this cocktail bar called Night of Joy, I think. It was a real kind of divey place, but it had cheap cocktails, happy hour. So I'd go in, I'd sit there in the dark with a candle, kind of with a printout of this paper, and every night I'd go through a few lines and try and work out what's going on there. Because even though a lot of people in the literature are a little bit dismissive about this approach, I think it's super important, not just to logic, but also metaphysically. I think there's lots of important stuff going on there. And this process of starting with something you find really difficult and working through it bit by bit until you've got to a point where you think, I've got something important out of this. That's, I think, what studying philosophy is all about. It's what makes it really enjoyable and worthwhile. Okay, next question. What do you think are the implications of P equals NP, one of the millennium problems for logic and philosophy? I would be very happy if you could expand on your answer. Okay, so like an essay question, right? Don't just give an answer, but explain your answer. Okay, this is super difficult, complicated stuff. So the question is P equals NP. What does that even mean? P, NP are complexity classes. So we're talking about computer science, and we're talking about not just whether something can be calculated or not, but how complex, how difficult is it to compute an answer? So imagine a Turing machine. It's going to compute a question. It starts off with ones and zeros on its tape, and it's kind of going to go back and forwards, rubbing out the ones and the zeros, adding more ones and zeros. How long will it take the Turing machine to do that? Or how many spaces on the tape will it take to do that? That's questions about the time and the space of the answer in proportion to the input. So given an input of a certain length, how much time, how much space on that tape is it going to need to compute the answer? So would the number of steps required to compute an answer be linear in the size of the input? Would it be exponential in the size of the input? Would it be polynomial in the size of the input? If it's polynomial, we're talking about complexity class P. That stands for polynomial relationship between the number of squares on the input and the number of steps the Turing machine has to go through to solve that problem. Okay, so these are deterministic classes, right? You get the input and you compute an answer. But there's also non-deterministic classes. So the idea here is rather than working out the answer, you guess the answer, and then your job is to check whether it's correct or not. So imagine it like this, right? Typically in a logic class, you might be given a question, does this entail this? And you have to give a natural deduction proof of the answer. But here's another thing you might do. Your teacher might give you the answer and say, check whether this really is a correct natural deduction proof. So you're going through each line, you say, yep, that follows from that, etc. That's a non-deterministic approach to this answer. Guess the answer and check that it's correct. So a non-deterministic complexity class is basically how complex is it to check that an answer is the right answer. NP is the polynomial non-deterministic class, right? There's a polynomial relationship between the question and checking that a correct answer is in fact a correct answer. Ooh, okay, so with all that in place, the question is the deterministic polynomial relationship the same class as the non-deterministic polynomial class? So that's basically to say, if you've got this problem that you can solve non-deterministically in polynomial time, could you also give an answer deterministically in polynomial time? And it seems like these are different things, right? Because checking whether an answer is correct or not sounds much easier than coming up with a correct answer in the first place. Okay, so pretty much everyone thinks that P and NP are different complexity classes. It's easier to do the non-deterministic thing than to do the deterministic thing. But nobody's ever found any problem that's in one but not the other. No one's ever found any problem that can be solved non-deterministically in polynomial time but not deterministically. So we don't know. We don't have a proof or a disproof whether P is the same or different to NP. But the question is, what do I think the implications are for logic and philosophy? For philosophy, I don't think there's much of an implication there at all, because this isn't really affecting logic, how we reason, what truth is, or anything like that. It's really affecting computation, how difficult, how efficient it is to compute things. Okay, so if it turns out that P equals NP, I mean, that would be pretty surprising. What we would get in that is a whole bunch of new proof techniques, so new kinds of ways of proving that this complexity class is the same or different to this one. So it will push mathematics, it will push computer science forward, whatever the answer comes out to be. Will it make any difference to philosophy? I don't think so. Next question. Do I think the hyperintensional revolution is coming? Oh, okay, this is a great question. So what does hyperintensional mean in the context of philosophy? So it's a term that's used in philosophy of language and logic. So we're thinking about a context or a phrase like believes or knows that's going to be followed by some sentence. So like, I believe that it's sunny outside right now, where replacing that sentence with a logically equivalent one, a classically equivalent one, might change the status of the whole sentence. So let me give you an example. I know that it's sunny outside right now. I know that it's either sunny or not sunny right now. That's a tautology. But replace that sunny or not sunny with a really, really complicated logical truth. It's equivalent to sunny or not sunny, but I might not know that they're equivalent. I might not know that that really complicated logical truth is in fact a logical truth because it's so blooming complicated, okay? So I might know sunny or not sunny, but I don't know the other one. They're logically equivalent, yet I can know one but not the other. So that is what we mean by a hyperintensional context. Traditionally, in classical logic, in classical semantics, there's really no way of accounting for this. Classical possible world semantics doesn't really have a place for propositions that differ even though they're logically equivalent. If they're logically equivalent, they're true in all the same possible worlds, so basically they're the same proposition, the same meaning, if you like. People have been talking about this for a long time, so the problem came up, I guess, originally in the classical Yarko-Hintikes semantics for knowledge and belief back in the 60s. By the 70s, people were talking about impossible possible worlds. In 1997, there was a journal issue on the metaphysics of impossible worlds. It's something that I've worked on quite a lot. I've written 2 books, one with Franz Berto on impossible worlds, their metaphysics, their semantics. So I've been one of these people sort of saying, yeah, you know, hyperintentionality, there's a place for that in philosophy of meaning, of language, in logic. So do I think the hyperintensional revolution is coming? Well, I kind of think to some extent it's already got here. There's an awful lot of work already out there over the past decade on impossible worlds and other approaches to these fine-grained contents that distinguish between necessarily equivalent contents. So I guess a different question is, where do I think this is going? How important is it going to be? I think one really, really important aspect of this is whether it's going to have an effect on metaphysics. Okay, so let me explain. Some people think, yeah, okay, some contexts, they're hyperintensional, like, what you believe, you might believe one thing but not the other, even though they're equivalent. But that's just because they're representations, right? Clearly, you can represent the world one way and a different way and kind of believe this one and not this one, even though they turn out to be equivalent. But that's just about language, just about representation. There's nothing important at the level of reality that is hyperintensional. Okay, a lot of people think this. I've come to the view that that's not right. So even though the main historical application of hyperintentionality is to belief and knowledge, I actually think there's a really important role for hyperintentionality in metaphysics. And I think one of the key notions in metaphysics is truth and grounding, saying that this is so because this is so. So thinking about truth, if you care not just about whether something's true, but how it's true, why it's true, then I think we're in the realm of hyperintentional notions. Okay, example, either it's sunny or it's not right now. That's true because it's sunny right now. Either grass is green or grass isn't green. That's true because grass is green. They are logically equivalent sentences. They've both got the form P or not P, but they're true because of different things. They're made true in different ways. They're grounded in different ways. So these central metaphysical notions are hyperintentional. And I think this has a role to play in modern semantical approaches. So not just impossible world semantics, but truth-maker semantics. Truth-maker semantics is something that takes this notion of the way in which something is made true or false as its central notion. That's the kind of central part of truth-maker semantics as opposed to possible world semantics. And I think truth-maker semantics is, in the next decade, going to play a big role, and hopefully, for me, not just in logic and semantics, but also in metaphysics. Blimey, that got pretty deep just there, didn't it? Next question. Do I have a stance on logical monism, pluralism, nihilism? Okay, good question. So logical monism is the idea that there is one logic that is the best. Maybe it's the one true logic, the one that really captures how we should reason. Pluralism, different ways of saying what pluralism is, but basically it's the idea that lots of logics are good. Nihilism, I'm not really sure what logical nihilism would be. There's no logic? That doesn't make much sense to me. Clearly there's good and there's bad reasoning, so there's got to be kind of logical ways of capturing that. Okay, whether there is just one logic that completely captures good reasoning. So I don't have definite settled views here. There's a version of pluralism that says lots of different logics are good for different purposes, and I definitely agree with that. But there's a stronger version of pluralism that says really there's no one thing as good reasoning. There's lots of different kinds of good reasoning, and I don't really agree with that, I guess. So I think if we think about truth preservation, I think classical logic is the one that gets truth preservation right. So if you care about your conclusion being true, if your premises are true, then classical logic is the one for that. So classical first or second order logic. If we care about reasoning and making the conclusions relevant to the premises, then we're talking about relevant logic. And personally, I think that relevant logic is really important, both to the development of logic, and I think it's got applications in metaphysics. But this thing about capturing relevance, sometimes I just think, we've got classical logic, and that's going to give us a load of irrelevant conclusions from the premises. But that's a pragmatic matter, whether we accept them, whether we introduce them to the discussion. It's not really a logical matter. I kind of flip on this. One thing I've definitely come to appreciate is that there is so much good stuff being done in all of these kind of new and crazy logics that we don't want to say, that one doesn't make sense, just chuck them all out and stick with classical logic. That is just bad conservative ways of thinking. So we let all these flowers bloom. Do we have to say they're all as good as each other? No, of course not. Some logics just work better, more tidily than others. But investigating all of the different kind of approaches out there, that's just a really healthy thing. Next question. What do I think of Val Plumwood's argument that classical logic is oppressive due to its negation. Is relevant logic really more feminist friendly? Oh, okay, this is really interesting. I'd basically forgotten about all of this. Val Plumwood was an Australian philosopher, logician, environmental activist, wrote a lot in the, I think, 70s and 80s. Incredible person, to be a logician, environmental activist, all of that in there together. And like a lot of Australian logicians at the time, she was central to building up relevant logics. And amongst that bunch of people, Val Plumwood, Richard Sylvan, Bob Mayer, there was this idea that there was something deeply wrong with classical negation, basically saying it's true or it's false, not both, not neither. And then an extra layer to that is that classical negation is not just logically bad, but it's also somehow socially bad, somehow oppressive. And I guess that's because thinking about categories like race or gender, we're saying you're either one or the other, not both, not neither. Do I think that's a good argument? No, I don't, and here's why. Suppose you want to resist that kind of classical binary approach. You're the one or you're the other, but not both, not neither. Here's a way of doing it that's perfectly compatible with classical logic. You just introduce more social categories, okay? So in the case of gender, you have man, you have woman, you have non-binary, you have maybe both, or you have neither, none of these things. You have all these different categories, as many of them as you like. But you can still have classical logic saying you're either in one of these categories or you're not. And maybe you can move, okay? You can move between categories over time. Maybe you self-identify. Maybe membership of these categories is given through certain social facts or through self-identification or whatever. All of that's compatible with classical logic. So I don't think there's something inherently oppressive about binary negation because it's not committing us to binary social categories. Let as many categories bloom in the social world as you like. We get to determine that, but we can do that all in accordance with classical logic. There are other problems with classical logic. You might think that your membership of one of these categories isn't an all or nothing matter, but that seems to me to be the general issue of vagueness, right? Things aren't always clearly one or the other. They might be vague. You might be on the borderline. There is an issue with how classical logic deals with vagueness, but that's not an issue of oppression. That's a general issue of semantics, and there are ways of accommodating vagueness within a classical framework. And a lot of people think that whatever your take on vagueness, you're kind of going to end up coming back to classical logic at some point. I don't know if that's right or not. But yeah, I think whatever the issues are with classical logic, it's not really about social oppression. That's a different issue. Next question. What are my top 5 philosophy books? Oh, blimey. Okay, how do you do a top 5 list? So I don't know what are the best 5 philosophy books of all time. I don't even know how you work out best in this context. The most influential books, that's a pretty standard, boring list of Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Descartes, whatever. How about I tell you what are the 5 books that really mean the most to me? Okay, I think I can do that and maybe it's more interesting. So first up, Wittgenstein, Philosophical Investigations. I could have done Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, but let's go with the investigations. I mentioned earlier about Wittgenstein and how as an undergraduate I went pretty deep into trying to understand Wittgenstein. There was this sense of this breath of fresh air, this guy who cut through, right, all these difficult philosophical kind of debates that never seemed to go anywhere. He gave us a method for saying how to dissolve these problems. Nowadays, I'm a bit more skeptical about that because I think in general you should be skeptical about the one method to solve all problems approach to philosophy. Philosophy is difficult and probably there isn't one method, there isn't one philosophy that answers all the questions out there. There was this kind of cult around Wittgenstein and I guess I felt drawn into this kind of huge personality that comes out of his books. So even though I'm a bit more skeptical about his philosophy these days, the insight, the importance of it for me is, it's really, really deep. He really changed philosophy in the 20th century. Yeah, in terms of the books that I've spent the most time with, the books that I keep coming back to year after year, I guess that's at the top of the list. Number 2, bit of a curveball here, Sophie's World by Justin Garder. So this is a popular philosophy book. It's basically a kid's book. It was written in the 90s. It's kind of the combination of a history of philosophy, but as told to a teenager, kind of mixed up with this story about a fiction within a fiction. The people in the story turn out at some point to be fictional characters and they're trying to fight their way out of the fiction into the real world. It's one of the books that I first read when my A-level teacher suggested I go and read some philosophy and think about it. So I got this book, and this kind of gave me a history of philosophy, much easier to read than Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy. Kind of bite-sized tastes of what Plato and Aristotle and Kant and Berkeley said. And it's really vivid the way it illustrates some of these views, particularly Berkeley, the idea that the world around us is kind of the creation of our minds, because these characters turn out to be locked inside this fiction, and one of the characters is the author who's writing the world of these characters, including Sophie, the main character. So it really kind of brings Berkeley's philosophy to life. And I think there's some really interesting thoughts in there about kind of what is the reality of fictional characters. We talk about fictional worlds. What kind of reality do they have? Is it just like the words on paper, or do those characters kind of have a life of their own? So there's a load of interesting and deep contemporary issues going on in this book, alongside this really accessible history of Western philosophy. So I think this book really kind of energized me in thinking about the issues of philosophy. It kind of confirmed for me, yeah, this is going to be a great thing to study at university. It's got some really great lines in it. Ladies and gentlemen, we're floating in space. That's a great metaphor for how philosophy makes you feel. It was taken up by Spiritualized for their album, Ladies and Gentlemen, We're Floating in Space. I think that's like the best album of all time. Controversial opinion, but I'm sticking with it. Number 3, something completely different, Computability and Logic by George Boulos and Richard Jeffrey. So, bit of a weird choice this, because it's a very kind of techie logic textbook. It kind of means a lot to me. So again, when my teacher said, go and read some philosophy, I went to the library, I went to the school library, to the public library. They didn't have a lot of philosophy books, but somehow I can't quite remember where. I found this battered old Open University textbook. It's the only thing they had on logic, and I just read this inside out as a, 16, 17-year-old. Didn't understand it, but I kind of got roughly the topics that it was about. One thing it covers really nicely is the limits of logic and maths and formal thinking, the incompleteness results, the undefinability of truth. And, although I didn't really understand fully what was going on there as a 17-year-old, obviously, it was like, oh wow, we can use maths to talk about what maths can't talk about, the kind of limits of that. So I guess kind of like what Wittgenstein's talking about in the Tractatus, you building up these techniques to say, here are the limits to what we can talk about, and beyond that, for Wittgenstein, it's silence. But this idea of using maths to talk about truth and meaning and stuff like that, I guess that's what I got out of this book. And as an undergraduate, as a postgraduate, as a teacher, when I was first putting my logic course together, I keep going back to this book. I've got the 3rd edition, the 4th edition, the 5th edition. All of them have got like sticky notes all over them. I just keep going back to it. And every time I go back to it, it kind of reminds me of being that teenager picking up logic and philosophy for the first time. And I guess going, wow, ladies and gentlemen, we're floating in space. Number 4, David Lewis on the Plurality of Worlds. This for me is the greatest philosophy book from the middle of the 20th century up till now. It's got absolutely everything you want in a philosophy book. It's got a central thesis that is basically crazy. It's mind expanding. This is not the only reality. There are possible worlds that are real and they are out there in reality. And it uses this crazy thesis to try to solve so many philosophical problems in metaphysics, in language, in logic, in philosophy of mind, all over the place. And it's beautifully written. Lewis has this way of saying, here's a problem. Let me explain the problem. Let me lay out all the different possible solutions. Let me say, that one's not right. That one's not right. That one's not right. This is the one. This is the one that solves all of these problems. So his reason for believing in this crazy thesis is that it's the one that solves the best all of these different philosophical problems. Do I agree with this book? No, of course not. But seeing the beauty in it, the way it's set out, I really think it's a model for how to do contemporary philosophical writing. Okay, last book. So I wanted to pick something that I've read fairly recently over the last decade that really meant something to me. And For me, it was a toss-up between two books, Making Things Up by Karen Bennett and How Things Might Have Been by Penelope Mackie. So these are both relatively contemporary books in metaphysics. Karen Bennett's book, Making Things Up, it's about, I guess, grounding. How Things Might Have Been, it's about the metaphysics of modality, possibility, necessity. They're both by fantastic philosophers. Making Things Up is very funny. It's very accessible. If you want a contemporary metaphysics book, I would definitely recommend that one. How Things Might Have Been by Penelope Mackie. She was a colleague of mine. She died 2 years ago. She died young of cancer. She's one of the philosophers that have most influenced me over the last decade through talking to her. I learned so much from her. She has this philosophical style that is, in one way, like David Lewis. You know, she lays out all the solutions and she's very, very even-handed. She doesn't kind of say, here's my answer and it's the right one. She's got this very old-fashioned way of kind of saying, here are all the possible options and here's what's right and here's what's wrong about this one. So very even-handed, very fair to all the different theories. Also very funny, there's a lot of personality coming out of this book. So I would definitely recommend that as a read. And while we're on the subject, I just want to say what a fantastic philosopher Penelope Mackie was. As well as writing this brilliant, important contribution to metaphysics, I think she's also the only person ever to have a poem published in the journal Mind. So she has this funny poem, A Modern Metaphysical Song. It's about all the different problems physicalists go through to try and work out how the mind can fit in with the physical world. But it's really, really clever. It's really funny. I'll put a link to that down below. Go and take a look at that and you can appreciate what a brilliant mind Penelope Mackie was. Okay, next question. With the current state of academia, if a student asked whether they should do a PhD in philosophy with the hopes of becoming a lecturer or researcher at the end of it, what would you say? Very broad question, I know. Okay, but good question. And I like the way it's put, asking about doing a PhD with the hopes of becoming a lecturer. I think that bit's important, right? Because if you are thinking of doing a PhD, I would say absolutely think hard about why you want to do a PhD. Lots of different reasons why you might do it. You might just do it as a hobby, out of interest, to kind of add meaning to your life. These are all great reasons. But if you're doing it because you want a job in academia, okay, so there's something very tangible you want out of this, it's important to think through exactly what all the factors are going into this. And I guess the first thing to say is the academic job market is not good right now. I mean, it hasn't been good for absolutely ages, right? When I was a PhD student, the academic job market was bad then. It takes most people years and years after their PhD to get a permanent job. That is not a 1 year, not a 6 month job, but something that hasn't got a definite end date. And a lot of PhD students with good PhDs don't get a job in academia at all. Not sure about the numbers, but for instance, in the UK, there are far, far more people getting PhDs from good universities than there are getting new jobs in academia in the UK. So what would I say to a student thinking about doing a PhD? Okay, so I find this really difficult because on the one hand, I want to make sure you've got all the information, and all the information basically says it's really, really difficult. You do a PhD, you spend a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money, and there is no guarantee of a job at the end of it. In fact, the chances of getting a job are pretty slim. On the other hand, if doing a PhD, working in academia is going to be the thing that adds meaning to your life, I don't want to put you off doing that. So I guess what I would say is, if you're going to do a PhD, do it in the way, make the choices that are going to maximize your chances of getting what you want, like a job or whatever, at the end of it. So this includes going to the right kind of institution, okay? So if you're thinking about going to study at this place, find out what their graduate placement is like. To some extent, this isn't rocket science. In the UK, if you do your graduate studies at Oxford, and you get a PhD, a DPhil from there, you've got a much better chance of getting a job than if you go to a university that's much lower down the rankings, okay? Doesn't mean you're a better student, doesn't mean you've got a better PhD, but that's just how it is. If you've got Oxford on your PhD, DPhil, more chance of getting a job. The supervisor also matters, okay? They matter from the point of view of how well they teach you, but they also matter from a point of view of how well known they are. So suppose you've got one person who studies with me and another person who studies with, let's say, Tim Williamson. He's the professor at Oxford. He's like the kind of big professor in the UK. I write my student a letter, Tim Williamson writes his student a letter, they both go for the same job. They might be equally good students, but one's got a letter saying this person's great from me, the other's got a letter saying this person's great from Tim Williamson. Other things being equal, probably the student who studied with Tim Williamson would get the job because his letter, his opinion, his saying this student is great carries more weight than it coming from someone like me. By the way, I'm not trying to put your study with me. If you want to do it, I would love that. So institution, supervisor, topic. If you're going to do a PhD, study the topic that you really love. But also be aware that some topics are more hireable than others. And this is what makes this really difficult. Right now, everyone's being hired in philosophy of AI. So if you started 5 years ago with your PhD in philosophy of AI, good for you. If you started 5 years ago with your PhD in metaphysics, nothing to do with AI, things are looking pretty tough for you right now. Does that mean you should go and study a PhD in philosophy of AI? Probably not, because in the 5 years it'll take you to graduate, all of those jobs will have gone and things will have moved on. Trying to work out what is going to be the hot topic in 5 years' time, I wouldn't try and pick a PhD on that basis. Okay, so how do you do this? Go and study the topic for your PhD that you really, really want to study, but keep an eye open for how the debate is going, right? If during your PhD, philosophy of whatever becomes really hot, read up on that stuff, maybe write a paper on that stuff so you can be an expert in, I don't know, metaphysics, but also have a kind of a sideline with a publication in whatever. Finally, treat your PhD like a job. Go in there and try and work out a time frame for what you're going to do in the first year, second year, third year. And your aim, if you want to get a job, is to publish stuff, to publish good stuff in good journals before you go on the job market, okay? You got to work backwards from there. If it's going to take you 6 months, 12 months, 18 months to publish, that's when you've got to be sending those papers off. So right away at the start of the PhD, you've got to put a plan together. You've got to talk to your supervisor, say, this is my aim. I want to publish some stuff. We need to work together on how we do this. A lot of people think, okay, my aim is to write a PhD so I can kind of, bumble around for a bit, think a load of things and then write it up at the end. Okay, that's a great way to finish a PhD, but it's not a great way to get a job at the end of it. It's not the PhD that gets you the job, it's typically your publications, and for those, you have to be thinking 12, 18 months ahead of when you're going to go on the job market. Final question. Okay, this is a similar one. I'm trying to navigate my way into a PhD from a master's, but I have interdisciplinary interests and my program is a bit untied to my main interest, so I don't have the possibility of finding a supervisor in my departments that can help me in building credibility. I am currently trying a lot of different ways, finding mentors outside of my department uni, attending summer schools, conferences, workshops, etc. But I would make great use of a couple of suggestions for people like me wishing to enter academia from this less affiliated, more freelance student position. Okay, so I'm not really kind of sure here what the freelance thing is. If you're doing a PhD, you're doing it in a department. Okay, so you're going to be affiliated with that department. That is where you're going to get your PhD from. And chances are people looking at your job applications are going to say, okay, this is somebody with a PhD from this institution. What I would say in this kind of case is if you have interests in, interdisciplinary whatever, so it's like philosophy of science or it's philosophy of mind with psychology or whatever, go to an institution, find a supervisor who is an expert, who is a world-renowned expert in those areas. Staying at an institution and saying, I want to work here and I'll just work with whoever kind of fits the bill least badly, that can be a fine thing to do, but from the point of view of getting a job, I really wouldn't recommend that at all. So if you can, go and do your PhD somewhere that has a reputation for being excellent, world-level excellent, in the areas that you're interested in, okay? If you want to do metaphysics, go to Oxford, go to St Andrews, NYU, whatever, okay? Don't just stick where you are and kind of try and make the best of it. So look, there's loads of different factors kind of vying off here. There's social stuff, there's your personal life, there's the financial stuff. They all pull in different directions. I'm just talking about is what is most likely going to give you a good chance of getting into academia, and that is go to the best institution you can that is the best for your particular area of study and go through the supervisor who has the best international reputation in that specific area. So I guess this question was asked from a background of like, maybe that's not possible or whatever. What do you do in that sort of case? One thing to think about is whether you can do some study periods from your institution to one of the kind of universities I'm talking about. Okay, so could you go and have a 6 month or whatever study period in different university, a different country, working with the kind of supervisor that I'm talking about. And then maybe they would be in a position to be a reference writer for you, writing you a letter that you will take forward to your job interview. So this isn't just about developing your interests and kind of building on your PhD, your publications, but it's also about, getting that reference letter written by somebody who's really well known in the field that you're interested in. And yeah, all the other stuff that you mentioned, finding mentors, going to conferences and workshops, summer schools, this is all really great stuff. When I was a PhD student going to summer schools, I learned a load, but I also met a load of people. But from the point of view of getting a job, it maybe has marginal benefit. Really, I think you need something a bit more committed and long-term, like a 6-month study visit to, the kind of university I've been talking about. Okay, so that was the 15K Q&A. Thank you so much for sending in those great questions. There's a load of exciting stuff I'm going to be working towards over the summer for this channel, including I'm going to start working towards building some courses that you guys can take. So watch this space, and if you want to study one-to-one with me through private tuition, go and take a look at my website. If you've enjoyed the discussion, you've got anything out of it, you can buy me a coffee or subscribe over on Ko-Fi. Thank you so much to all my Ko-Fi subscribers. You really make this content possible. Thank you to you for watching this far. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see you back on Attic Philosophy soon.